on April 15, 1912, at 12:27 a.m. The captain of the Titanic commanded his assistant, Jack Phillips, to send a CQD distress message in Morse code to all the ships around it. After 6 attempts with no response, the assistant Jack noticed something, that the distress code changed to SOS. The assistant sent his message, and indeed all the ships responded, except for one, the closest ship to the Titanic, the SS Californian. At that critical moment, its radio operator was asleep. This negligence became a pivotal factor in the disaster, leading to significant changes in maritime navigation laws. The tragedy highlighted the need for continuous radio watch, and the operator's failure to act that night underscored the importance of vigilance. If he had been awake and attentive, the SS Californian might have been able to render aid, potentially saving more than 1,500 lives and altering the course of the Titanic disaster. On March 31, 1912, the WhiteStarLine proudly announced the completion of the Titanic. The construction process had taken 3 full years, involving thousands of workers who labored tirelessly to bring this engineering marvel to life. Titanic began its first voyage on April 10, 1912, departing from Southampton with great fanfare. Its length was 882 feet long, making it one of the longest ships of its era. The Titanic stood at a towering height of 175 feet. Its width spanned 92 feet, providing stability and ample space for its lavish accommodations. This massive ship was designed to be a floating city, complete with luxurious amenities, state-of-the-art technology, and unparalleled grandeur, all of which contributed to its reputation as the most impressive vessel ever built. The Titanic was divided into 16 watertight compartments, each separated from the others. Why, you might ask? If the ship were to hit something or develop a hole, the captain could lock off the damaged compartment, isolating it from the rest. However, there's a crucial limit to this design. The calculations were precise. The ship could remain afloat if up to 4 compartments were flooded. But if water breached 5 compartments, the unthinkable would happen. The ship would be doomed to sink. The size, layout, and innovative design of the compartments made the Titanic famous, and it was widely marketed as the unsinkable ship. This claim of invincibility was heavily promoted after the Olympic, a sister ship of the Titanic, had an accident in 1911. The Olympic, Titanic's older sister ship, was involved in a collision with the HMS Hawke on September 20, 1911. The Olympic was sailing in the Solent Strait between the Isle of Wight and the mainland of England, and was traveling alongside the HMS Hawke, a British Royal Navy warship designed to ram and sink other ships. While the Olympic was significantly larger and faster, it made a turn that caused a suction effect due to its large displacement, which pulled the smaller Hawke towards it. The Hawke was unable to evade the Olympic, leading to the collision. The Olympic's collision with a naval vessel caused damage, but its compartmentalized structure helped it avoid sinking, reinforcing the belief in the effectiveness of this design. WhiteStarLine Company took advantage of this for its personal propaganda. WhiteStarLine proudly boasted, "Do you all see our magnificent ship, the Olympic? A warship rammed into it, puncturing 2 of its compartments with water flooding in, and yet it didn't sink. So come, passengers, and sail across the Atlantic Ocean on one of the largest ships in history." But they didn't stop there. The captain at the helm of the Olympic during the collision, Captain Edward Smith, was seen as a man of experience and composure. So when the time came for the Titanic's maiden voyage, the WhiteStarLine declared, "We will personally make him captain of the Titanic, entrusting him with command of what was believed to be the most unsinkable ship ever built." According to the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, the Titanic was expected to take less than 2 hours to sink after such catastrophic damage. However, the ship actually took 2 hours and 40 minutes to completely go under. While the extra time gave passengers and crew a slightly larger window for evacuation, it wasn't enough to save everyone due to the lack of lifeboats and the chaos that ensued during the disaster. Andrew's calculations, based on the flooding of the compartments, highlighted how dire the situation was, but even with the extended time, tragedy was unavoidable. The Titanic was not the only ship heading for New York that day. Another vessel, the SS Californian, had set out ahead, following the same route. While on its journey, the Californian encountered small icebergs, what could be called teenage icebergs in comparison to the towering ones further ahead. Sensing the potential danger, the lone radio operator aboard the SS Californian sent a message to all nearby ships, warning, "Take care. There is ice ahead." This crucial message was meant to alert ships like the Titanic of the impending ice fields in the North Atlantic. However, as fate would have it, this warning, though received by the Titanic, did not lead to immediate changes in course or speed, and the tragedy that followed would be one of history's most devastating maritime disasters. The Californian radioed Titanic at approximately 19 hours, warning of an ice field in which the Californian nearly collided with herself. Unfortunately, the radio operator on the Titanic didn't bother with the initial message from the SS Californian. He neither replied to it nor wrote it down. The warning about ice ahead, a vital piece of information, was ignored in the busy communication hub of the Titanic. 15 minutes later, the warning was sent again. This time, the radio operator finally received it and passed it on to the officer on duty. But by then, the Titanic had already continued at full speed, 22 knots an hour. Unlike the Californian ship that decided to stop and wait until the next day. At 10:55 p.m., the steamship Californian radios the Titanic say, "Old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." But there were still so many messages from the passengers to relay, and the interruption was not welcomed by Phillips, who responds, "Shut up. Shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." And he ignored the warning message that time and did not deliver it to the captain. And with that message received, the radio operator of the Californian turns off his radio and retires to bed. The SS Californian was just 6 miles from the Titanic at this point.
Arrogant bastard. I try and warn him about the ice and he tells me to shut up. And listen to that spark, he must be right on top of us. Well, that's it for me. I'm shutting down.
By now the Titanic was sailing at 21 knots, the air was distinctly cold, and out of the darkness Fleet noticed a slightly blurred, black object slowly coming into focus. The iceberg was first spotted by Frederick Fleet, one of the lookouts aboard the Titanic, at 11:40 p.m. On April 14, 1912, Fleet, who was stationed in the crow's nest, noticed the iceberg directly in the ship's path. He immediately rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge to report the sighting with the words, "Iceberg right ahead." Despite the quick reaction, the proximity of the iceberg gave the Titanic's crew only about 37 seconds to try and steer the ship away. Unfortunately, the attempt to turn was too late, and the Titanic struck the iceberg on its starboard side, leading to the disaster. James Paul Moody was the 6th officer aboard the Titanic. He was the youngest officer on the ship, at just 24 years old. Moody was the officer who received Fleet's call from the crow's nest, warning, "Iceberg, right ahead." After relaying the message, he worked with First Officer William Murdoch in the moments leading up to the collision as they tried to steer the ship away from the iceberg. Unfortunately, the Titanic hit the iceberg moments later. It's important to mention that Frederick Fleet testified at the subsequent inquiries into the disaster that, had he and fellow lookout Reginald Lee been issued binoculars, they could have spotted the iceberg earlier. When asked how much sooner they could have seen it, Fleet replied, "Well, enough to get out of the way." At 12:27 a.m., the Titanic's radio operator finally sent out distress signals to the ships around it. Many of the nearby vessels responded, but the SS Californian remained silent. In the aftermath, during the Californian crew's testimony, they admitted to seeing a light coming from the direction of the Titanic. However, they didn't respond to it. This light wasn't normal, nor was it some celebratory signal or festive escape. What they were witnessing were Morse code distress signals, flashing lights from the Titanic's signal lamps, known as Morse bulbs, turning on and off to send the desperate SOS plea. Additionally, the Titanic used Morse lamps to send light signals, attempting to communicate with nearby ships, including the Californian, by flashing the SOS distress code. Despite these efforts, the Californian's crew failed to interpret the signals as a call for help, further compounding the disaster. The lack of an immediate response from nearby ships played a crucial role in the loss of over 1,500 lives. On the SS Californian, despite being the closest ship to the Titanic, no immediate action was taken to respond to its distress signals. Here's what happened on the Californian that night. By the time the Titanic began sending distress signals around 12:27 a.m., the Californian's only radio operator, Cyril Evans, had already turned off the wireless and gone to bed. Before this, Evans had sent warnings about ice in the area, but these went largely unheeded by the Titanic. Around 12:45 a.m., crew members aboard the Californian, including the second officer Herbert Stone, saw white rockets being fired from a ship in the distance. Stone reported this to Captain Stanley Lord, who was resting in the chart room. However, the nature of the rockets was unclear to them, as rockets could sometimes be used for non-emergency purposes, and they did not immediately recognize them as distress signals. Despite multiple reports of the rockets and Stone's concern, Captain Lord did not order his crew to wake the radio operator or attempt to communicate with the ship directly. Lord assumed the ship was not in immediate danger, and instead suggested they try contacting the ship at daybreak. The inaction of the Californian and its crew became a major point of controversy and was heavily criticized during the official inquiries into the Titanic disaster. Many believed that if Captain Lord had responded promptly, the loss of life could have been significantly reduced. The Carpathia was about 100 kilometers away from the Titanic when disaster struck. It was originally sailing in the opposite direction, but when the distress signal was received, Captain Arthur Rostron made a decisive and heroic choice. He immediately ordered the ship to change course and race towards the Titanic at full speed, pushing the Carpathia beyond its normal operating limits to try to reach the scene as quickly as possible. Here's a brief outline of the communication. The time now is 3:30 in the morning, and a white light appears in the sky. But this time, it's not from the Titanic. This light is from the RMSCarpathia, the ship that had been racing through the night to answer the Titanic's distress call. The Carpathia was announcing its arrival with an introductory message in the sky on the Carpathia. Thanks to Captain Arthur Rostron of the RMSCarpathia, about 705 people were rescued from the Titanic's lifeboats. His swift and courageous response, navigating through dangerous ice fields at top speed, ensured that hundreds of lives were saved that night. However, despite their best efforts, they couldn't save those in the freezing waters, as hypothermia claimed the lives of many before help could arrive. And despite popular myths, there was no dramatic scene of someone floating on a wooden plank with their beloved, only the cold reality of one of the greatest maritime tragedies in history. To help visualize the sinking of the Titanic, I created a small simulation using a ship sinking application. Take a look at how it all unfolded. Now, we have some important questions to address about the Titanic disaster. Why did the ship continue to sail with so few lifeboats? Why were only 705 people able to get onto lifeboats? Well, the first reason is outdated lifeboat regulations. Maritime safety laws at the time only required ships to carry enough lifeboats based on their tonnage, not their passenger capacity. For the Titanic, which was built to carry over 2,200 passengers and crew, only 20 lifeboats were required, enough for just over half the people on board. These regulations hadn't kept pace with the increasing size of ships like the Titanic. The second reason is overconfidence in the ship's design. The Titanic was widely marketed as unsinkable due to its advanced compartmentalized design. The belief was that even in the unlikely event of an accident, the ship would stay afloat long enough for nearby ships to rescue passengers, so fewer lifeboats were seen as acceptable. Finally, despite the lifeboats having the capacity to hold around 1,100 people, only 705 passengers made it into them. This was largely due to panic, confusion, and mismanagement during the evacuation. Some lifeboats were launched half-empty, while others were delayed due to the women and children first policy, leaving many men and even some women and children behind. Another key factor was that Captain Edward Smith, the Titanic's captain, had not conducted any training or rehearsals for an emergency of this scale. There was no protocol for using the lifeboats, which led to chaotic and slow loading procedures. Instead of the lifeboats being launched efficiently within 10 minutes, it often took half an hour to fill and launch each one, wasting precious time and costing many lives. What's even more shocking is that, in the immediate aftermath, some newspapers falsely reported that no lives were lost, adding to the confusion and disbelief surrounding the tragedy. The true scale of the disaster only became clear later, when it was confirmed that over 1,500 lives had been lost. Most of the third-class passengers never even made it to the lifeboats. Why? Because they were locked behind iron gates from the start of the trip until the end. This was due to the common prejudice that third-class passengers were poor and often brought disease due to their supposed lack of hygiene. In fact, after every trip, third-class passengers, or anyone who interacted with them, had to go through quarantine. Let me tell you something even more shocking. 3/4 of the third-class passengers died, with approximately 500 out of 700 perishing. Most were trapped at the bottom of the ship, and when it sank, they were carried to the depths of the ocean. Despite the tragic outcome, it's important to note that, at the time, third-class passengers on the Titanic were relatively well off compared to other ships. The price of a third-class ticket on the Titanic was about the same as a first-class ticket on many other large ships. There is a very logical theory that says if the Titanic had slammed directly into the iceberg without trying to turn away, the ship might not have sunk. While the impact could have caused serious injuries or even fatalities due to inertia, as passengers inside the ship would be propelled forward, when the ship suddenly slowed, the damage to the vessel itself might have been more contained. Had the Titanic collided head-on, fewer compartments would likely have been breached, possibly fewer than the critical 4 compartments the ship could sustain before sinking. First off, the collision bulkheads were designed to withstand a crash with another ship, not a giant iceberg. In a collision between two ships, the impact would be shared between them, and both would absorb some of the force, likely allowing them to stay afloat. But an iceberg is stationary, meaning the Titanic would absorb most of the energy from the collision. Given the speed at which the Titanic was traveling, a head-on impact would have transmitted this force along the entire length of the ship. Imagine a 46,000-ton vessel moving at around 20 knots hitting an iceberg that could weigh over 100,000 tons. This collision would likely generate a tremendous force, causing severe damage to the ship. In 1907, a German ship collided with an iceberg head-on and continued its journey without any loss of life. But in the case of the Titanic, the side impact caused water to continuously fill the compartments. As I mentioned earlier, the compartments weren't sealed at the top, so once one filled with water, it overflowed into the next, and the sinking progressed. What do you think? Could the Titanic have survived if it had hit the iceberg head-on instead of turning away? Share your thoughts in the comments.